Hey, hey, it's Aaliyah with Daley Conversations, and we have a special guest with us. Don is in the building. I wish I had like a little cheering thing so I could say, yeah, yeah, woo. But Don is here with us. I'm going to let Don introduce himself by telling us something interesting about you, who you are, and what you do.
I don't know how interesting it is, but I'll share what I can. Uh, I'm I have worked in the field of education now for almost 50 years. Uh,
Wow.
I I took an early retirement for a job as a labor relations specialist for the teachers union in New York State. This was in 1994, and I founded the Institute for Learning Centered Education. And uh, Learning center education, which is based on what's called constructivist theory of how people learn, suggests that we only learn when we're actively engaged with information that someone wants us to understand and be able to apply. So that requires that teachers uh, create projects, create tasks for students, and do the teaching through interventions while students are working on something that's meaningful for them. And for 25 years, we conducted a 1 week international summer conference where we tried to model what we wanted to see happening in classrooms. And we drew teams from throughout the United States. We had teams come from India, from New Zealand, from Canada, and uh, we kept that going. We actually did 30 such conferences over a 25-year period till just before the pandemic. And what I'm doing now is, well, let me put it this way. Uh, my brother and I are very close. Gary and I rarely talked about our careers. We would talk about sports, politics, family. Was it chickens or ducklings that mom kept in a corner of the kitchen one winter? Uh, and about all I knew was that Gary was considered a pioneer in the field of autism. Uh, Unfortunately, about 6 years ago, Gary was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I decided to write a book about him, and so that there'd be a legacy, so that his children and grandchildren would have something to fall back on. And over a 3 month period during the pandemic, I held 1 to 2 hour Zoom interviews with 83 different people around the world, none of whom I knew beforehand. Uh, People in the field of education, professionals, parents of children with autism, people with autism, and others who had an interest for one reason or another. And in October of 2022, I published my book, and I was ready to tell my wife she could stop telling people Don's a failure at retirement. Uh, but all of a sudden, because of my experience in education, I realized there was a very important aspect of autism that nobody was addressing. There are organizations doing wonderful research. There are organizations providing direct services to people with autism and their families, but no one is addressing the people in our schools, community organizations, and first responders who interact regularly with people with autism and have little or no information to guide them. Uh, so the first thing I did uh, when my book was published was uh, I asked for and got an endorsement from my entire organization's board of directors and advisory council to focus our organization 100% on autism. And then I worked with some professionals in the field, and we created a list of 20 tips, which most of our work now focuses on. Tips that have two things in common. They are very easy to understand, but you can't expect most people to know about them unless they come to a workshop or do some reading. For example, tip number one, people with autism often fear physical contact. How many times a day throughout the United States does a bus driver, a teacher, a principal give a well intended pat on the back to a student with autism? The student then has a tantrum because they fear physical contact, which many of them do. And the worst of it is the person giving the pat on the back doesn't even realize it was that pat on the back that set off the tantrum. So they just figure this is a behavioral problem that comes with being autistic. And I've got 28 stories that I collected in 2 days from parents about misunderstandings like this that resulted in suspension from school. I'll give one example. A grandmother told me this. Her 7-year-old grandson Peter uh, uh, threw a tantrum. Well, first he would sit in the back of the classroom. The teacher would move him toward the front. The next day, Peter's in the back again. Teacher moves him to the front. 3 more days of this, teacher sends him to the office to see the principal. While the principal is talking to Peter, Peter's looking in another direction. So the principal takes this as a sign of disrespect and suspends Peter for a week. The grandmother says to me, Don, he's 7 years old. He doesn't even know what he did that was wrong. What good is a suspension going to do? Well, what the teacher didn't realize is that a sound that to you or I may be uh, hardly noticeable can be deafening to someone with autism. What the principal didn't realize was, as someone with autism said to me, said, Don, if you insist that I look you in the eye, I will try, but I won't be able to hear a word you're saying. It's when I look away from you that I'm able to focus on understanding. Well, we created 20 tips like these, easy to understand, but most people don't know them. And we focus our workshops around them. We created a 2-hour workshop, which we are now doing around the country because we can do the entire thing virtually. And if any of your listeners would like, all we need is a minimum of 10 people and a contact person, and we'll set up our 2-hour session. And we know we know we have an impact because at the end of each workshop we do, I distribute a questionnaire, just 5 simple questions. Was it worthwhile or not? What had the biggest impact on you? What, if anything, will you do differently as a result of our workshop together? And the feedback I get indicates, well, we get almost unanimous. At this point, we've reached over 900 people in the last year, and all but 8 of them have said that the conference was worthwhile for them. And on the question, what, if anything, will you do differently? We get a lot of responses that indicate to us that people now understand autism better and will change the way they interact with people on the spectrum. What am I doing? Who am I and what am I doing? I'm just a person trying to do his part. I'm a gap filler. I'm not an intellectual. I'm not a researcher, but I find gaps where nobody else is doing something that's needed, and I try and fill them. And right now, I'm filling the gap of working with people to try and address the fact that we've got too many people who interact regularly with people with autism and have little or no information to guide them. And it's very rewarding because I now have an organization with 30 people who are very active. We're all volunteers. Nobody gets paid a penny for the work that we're doing. And as a result, we are able to provide our services without charging. So if anyone wants our 2-hour session, there's no fee for it. And we've also been doing a number of 1 full day sessions. In fact, tomorrow I have a full day session with a turnaway capacity crowd of 75 people registered. They're teachers, teacher assistants, aides. We did a police academy recently, and we've now we did a full day autism forum in Asheville, North Carolina this summer. The session tomorrow will be in Northern New York. We did our 2-hour sessions with a school in California where we worked on 4 consecutive days, 50 teachers a day, and administrators, so that we reached the entire staff of the school in 4 days with 4 sessions of 50 participants each. We're now doing student groups and getting a terrific response. we've done middle school students, we've done high school students, and they demonstrate on their post session questionnaires that we've really reached them. And the only thing we do differently with students than we do with adults is we do a little more of an emphasis on bullying, because we recognize that bullying is a problem in almost every school in the country. And I've got a couple of people, one of whom is usually with me when I do a session, and people with autism. And when they talk about what they're like and what it's like for them, it really makes an impression on adults and students. And one of the questions I'll always ask them if it's a student group is, have you ever been bullied? And they will invariably say yes. And then I'll ask them, how does it make you feel? And what we can see happens is that while they're responding as a person with autism, the students in our audience make the transfer to the fact that this is the way anybody being bullied feels, not just somebody with autism. So we feel that when we work with student groups, we accomplish even more than just helping them understand autism.
Can you talk a little bit more about who your brother is? Just because when you tell me who he is, I was like, wow, I heard of Teach. It is very big. And so I would love for you to talk about, especially since he's kind of like the pioneer of someone who introduced you to autism.
My work on the book was really therapeutic for me, because obviously it's frustrating. We try and visit Gary at least once every couple of months, and he's in Chapel Hill in a nursing home. And to have so many people say so many wonderful things about him it's really been therapeutic for me. But Gary is 4 years younger than I am. He in college at Stanford University, he chose to room with someone who, as a result of polio, was paralyzed from the neck down. So Gary had to care for him on a daily basis in addition to his studies. He went to North Carolina in 1973 to do postdoctoral work. And it was just by chance that he got into the field of autism. But he was assigned as his mentor, Eric Shopler, who was at that time one of the leading researchers in the field of autism. And a couple of interesting anecdotes I can throw in. Eric had been most people that I talk with now have never heard of the refrigerator mother theory. But the refrigerator mother theory, which held sway for about 30 years, starting in the late 1960s, held that women were responsible for autism in their children by being cold and distant during the child rearing years. And imagine what it must have been like for a mother who's already feeling guilty, although there's no reason for her to, but she's feeling guilty because her child is not what others would consider normal. And then to be told that it's your fault, it's because you were cold and distant. It was just horrible. And there was a man, I'll think of his name, who promulgated this theory. Interestingly, in a book entitled In a Different Key, which made the New York Times bestseller list in 2016, the authors suggested that the reason that this theory was able to hold sway for 30 years, even though it was so ridiculous, was because of two things. The researchers there weren't enough diagnosed cases of autism to make it worthwhile for the researchers to look into it. And secondly, the researchers were 100% sure that they already knew autism was caused by the mother. I read a draft of my book to my daughter, who was 30 at the time, and she said, "Dad, there's another reason for the refrigerator mother theory holding sway." I said, "What?" She said, "The patriarchy." And as soon as my daughter said that, it dawned on me, of course, all of the researchers in the 1970s and around then were men. Why should they challenge a theory that said that the blame for autism should go on the woman? But anyway, Eric had a 3-year grant to work with parents that ended in 1970. And he said to the parents, if we're going to continue our work, we've got to find a way to get money from the legislature to spread what we're doing. And so the parents came up with the idea that they would, at the annual legislative breakfast, they would seat people with autism and their parents at tables intermingled with the legislators. Well, and this is as told to me by the person who interviewed Eric Schopler and got this information from him. As Eric told the story, the lieutenant governor of North Carolina at the time was the influential person. He set the agenda for the legislature. But unfortunately, he arrived late to the breakfast and they only had a half an hour on the agenda. So he came in late and he just took a seat at a table that included the one person with autism, the one young child with autism that they would least like to have him seated next to. And while Eric stood and watched from a distance, the child with autism picked up a load of grits and trying to hand it to the lieutenant governor, spilled it all over his tie. So as Eric tells the story, I thought, well, there goes a chance for any legislative funding. But fortunately, the lieutenant governor understood that the child was trying to make a gesture, and he did push through the legislature, making North Carolina the first state in the nation to have any kind of legislative funding for autism. And what Eric Schopler did with that information was he created 7 centers, most of which still exist in North Carolina, 7 centers throughout the state so that they could reach people in the rural areas as well as in the triangle, Durham and Chapel Hill and Raleigh. Now, my brother came to North Carolina in 1973, and Eric was assigned as his mentor, and that's what got Gary into autism. In 1978, Gary became Eric's assistant director officially. In 1993, Gary took over as director, but Eric continued to work with him until 2006 when he passed away. So over the course of 40 years, Gary was literally, many people told me, known as the person in the world to go to for information and training on autism. He took his training to Japan, and he was invited back every year for 40 years to do workshops. He took his training to the United Kingdom and made 62 visits over 40 years. He visited most of the states in the United States and is responsible for a lot of the organizations that grew out of his work with them. Now, in the United States, there are 2 prominent organizations. One is Gary's TEACCH, all caps TEACCH. The other is the ABA, Analytical Behavior or Association of Behavioral Analysis. In the United States only, ABA is more popular because they got to your insurance companies first. But throughout the rest of the world, people would tell me the TEACCH program and the training that Gary developed is the foundation of their work in autism. I mean, he was just beloved wherever he went. And that's why I was able to get the 83 interviews. All I had to do was send an email to someone and say, I'd like to interview you for a book I'm writing about Gary. And within 24 hours, they would respond and say, yes, when do you want to set up the Zoom? After a while, people were contacting me and saying, we hear you writing a book about your brother. He did so much for me or for my child or my family. Do you want to interview me? So it's been very heartwarming for me. And one other thing that came out of this, I hadn't thought to try to interview anybody who had been to high school with my brother, because I know when I was in high school, I didn't do anything that would be worthwhile enough for somebody to want to learn about it. But apparently, Gary was an academic and athletic hero in high school, and I stumbled on that accidentally. One of the last people I interviewed, it was a professor in Michigan, and I was interviewing him because I thought that I had finished with all my interviews when someone said, have you talked with anyone about Gary's work with the criminal justice system? And I said, no. And he gave me some names to contact. And one of the people I contacted was a professor in labor relations in Michigan, whose wife had been a roommate to a girl in high school who was in Gary's class. So he put me in touch with her. And then when my book came out, somebody in Denver contacted me. He had been in Gary's class, and his brother had been in my class 4 years earlier, and he had a child with autism who'd been helped by Gary. So anyway, with those two contacts, I created a mailing list ultimately of over 100 people in Gary's class, collected a lot of anecdotes, and then one of them, Gene Morrow, said, "Why don't we start a an endowment in Gary's name from the class of 1963? I'll contribute $10,000 to get it started." And then a friend of his, an investment banker named Bob Brown, uh, who had been a year behind Gary in high school but had played sports with Gary, said, I'll contribute $10,000. And pretty soon we had enough money raised. And the long and short of it is a $2,000 grant will be given this year to somebody at North Carolina University in the TEACCH program who's just getting into the field. And there's a $50,000 endowment guaranteed in Gary's name from the class of 1963. So I'm just thrilled that that's taking place. And that's just one of the unanticipated consequences of the work that we've been doing in autism.
Wow, that is so amazing. Like I said, I've heard of Teach. I was actually looking at the program and seeing about it at Chapel, North Carolina Chapel Hill, just because I want to like either receive a certification or just do more work in special education. So I was definitely looking into that. And so I know you in your book you highlighted your brother's story, who Gary is, and you also highlighted autism. What is it that you want people to know about autism that you think everyone should know?
6 years ago, my perception of autism was based on one person in our congregation who would sing out in a high pitched voice 2 or 3 lines of a hymn, stop. A couple of minutes later, he'd rejoin the congregation singing another 2 or 3 lines. That was my understanding of autism. I figured all people with autism were like this one person. Uh, we find that many of the people who come to our 2 hour sessions come with that same understanding. Autism is based on one person they know, and sometimes not even anybody they know. Sometimes it's based on one thing they read or heard. When they leave our 2 hour sessions, they understand why it's called a spectrum. They understand why we say that to know one person with autism is to know one person with autism. And as I've indicated before on our questionnaire afterwards, they'll say things like, well, one of the things I'll do differently is I'll have more patience, or I will approach some of my students with autism and sit down and have a discussion with them so I can learn more about their unique situation. So we know we're having an impact. What I want people to know about autism, I want them to know that it's not like one of these things, there are a lot of challenges we have in this world that are just beyond our capacity to meet. What I want people to know is they need very little information that will change their perceptions of autism and, more importantly, change the way they interact with people with autism. As I said before, our sessions are focused on our 20 tips. Those alone are invaluable. So I just want people to know that people with autism are human beings just like you and I. Some of them have what one person I work with calls his superpower, which is an exceptional talent in one area or another. They have feelings, and many of them are among our major contributors to society. But all of them are just like you and me. They have feelings. It just takes a little bit of extra effort from us to be able to communicate with them, because one of the characteristics of many people with autism is a difficulty with verbal communication. difficulty understanding it, and difficulty uh, letting other people understand what they're saying. One person with autism said to me, Don, uh, if I take more time than the average person to respond to a question, it's not because I don't know the answer. I just takes me more time to process out what I want to say. And he said, it's very frustrating for me when a teacher or someone else asks me a question and then thinking they're doing me a favor because they think I'm going to be embarrassed because I don't know the answer. They don't give me time to show them that I do have an answer to their question. So that's all I want people to know. Take just a little bit of time. We can do it for you in less than 2 hours. A little bit of time to learn a little bit about autism, because the number of people diagnosed with autism has gone from 1 in 1,000 25 years ago to 1 in 34 now. It's a local autism society member told me that they've had double the number of pre-K students with autism this year than they had last year. So people with autism are all around us. The number is increasing exponentially, and hopefully we'll start to deal with it before it becomes a real crisis, both for the people with autism who suffer severe trauma when people don't understand them or take the time to try, but also for the disruptions that it can cause in a classroom, in a community event. So all around, people with autism suffer trauma. People who interact with them in situations have to deal with the consequences of not understanding them. One cute story about first responders that a policeman told me. He stopped someone with who he didn't realize it, but had autism, and he's looking. It's a teenager, and he's looking over his driver's license. He says, "I see you're 16 years old. When will you be 17?" The person with autism, exhibiting a characteristic of many people with autism, that they take things extremely literally, said in all sincerity, "I will be 16 or 17 on my next birthday." Well, the police officer admitted, my reaction was, this is a wise ass. And those kinds of misunderstandings can be avoided. That's why the short answer to your question is, I want the public to understand more about autism.
That is so deep, because we do see a lot of instances where people are, they have either a mental illness or, like you said, someone on the spectrum, and they come into contact with different people, and we don't know, or people don't know how to interact with someone who is, other than or different. I don't even want to say different, and that's what I think is really great for this next question. Because you do a lot of training, but why do you think it's important for parents, teachers, or anyone that's working with children or children on the spectrum to continue to get training and to learn and grow in the area of autism?
Well, most of the people in our world are good people, caring people. But like I said before, there are a lot of things that need to be changed in our world, but it's beyond our capacity to. This is something where, we're not even asking people to contribute lots of money. And so many of your listeners I know are wonderful people who contribute tens, hundreds, thousands of dollars to worthwhile charities. So these people, if they realize how little time they need to contribute to learn just a little bit about autism and how much bang for the buck there is in that, I know they'll be responsive. That's why our challenge is just to let people know there are just a few simple things. We've characterized them as 20, but there are just a few simple things you need to understand about autism, and it will change the world for you and for them. So, again, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and that's why people are joining with me. And, for the parent of a child with autism, they go through hell being a good parent and a good advocate. And then to have to, and so many parents tell me about problems they've had with the local school or agencies, which don't have to happen. And to go through the hell of doing your best to raise your child, and then to have to fight the schools and the agencies that are supposed to be there to support you, it's unconscionable.
I've had an experience, and I would love, I mean, since you're here, I would love to talk to you about this. But I recently subbed at a school, and there was a child on the spectrum in the classroom, and the classroom is full. It's like 20 kids in the classroom. And so the classroom, I'm the sub. The teacher has been gone for 2 days. The previous sub, they were telling me, was like really mean and like, kids. She was yelling at us and. So, I come in, and I'm more refreshing. The class gets a little rowdy because I'm like, okay, they trying to test my kindness. But the class gets a little rowdy, and the child on the spectrum begins to get rowdy and very aggressive. Like he starts to take his headphones and starts to swing them around and hit them on the desk, and he eventually breaks his headphones, which makes him even more upset. So while the class is rowdy, I'm like, you know what? I think I just need to focus on him, get him calm, and then maybe everyone else will calm down, or well, like just focus on what you can focus on. So I go over there to him. He's a little bit upset because I let him cool down a little bit because he was, like I said, he was being very aggressive. So I let him kind of cool down on his own. And then when I went over there, because he was upset about his headphones, I talked to him. He wanted to call his grandpa because his grandpa can fix his headphones. So I was like, well, you got to give me your number. You got to give me grandpa's number, and I'll try to call him. Now, I knew I wasn't going to call grandpa, but I was just trying to come up with a solution. So he was trying to figure out grandpa's number, and he showed me the numbers, and I was like, well, he had like 6 numbers. I was like, well, a phone number is 9 numbers. So I need you to come up with the other numbers. So that actually got him really focused, and he sat down because he really wanted to think about his grandpa's number, and he was thinking about it, and that calmed him down, got him focused, and then I was able to get the rest of the class calm. But I just want to know like your perspective on that situation, because honestly, I didn't know what to do. I was so like taken aback because I've never been in a situation where a student has been aggressive towards me. I was kind of taken aback, and I had to like take a little step back. And then once he calmed down a little bit and I went over there, that's when we kind of rectified the situation. And I built a relationship with him, and we kind of talked a little bit. And throughout the rest of the day, he was good. Like he was by my side. He was good. I mean, we had some ups and downs, but for him to just know me for that day, I feel like it was after that part of the day, everything else went well. But I would love to know your perspective. I think that's the reason why, it's important for teachers to get trained, because in that situation, I really didn't know what to do. But I would love to hear your perspective.
The premise that with all the contacts I have, I'm still no expert on autism. I don't pretend to be, but I probably have more contacts than anybody else as a result of the interviews I did for the book. And every time we do our 2-hour session, I have an expert, if he can't be there in person, zooming in. So I've got a cadre now of about 6 people, some of them in Asheville, one in Wisconsin, and at least one of them will zoom in when we do a session. So I've heard them answer questions like the one you just posed, and I can give you an indication. First of all, it sounds like you did everything correctly. The most important thing is to establish a trust relationship with them, and just like anybody else, they will sense whether your concern is for them or just for the problem they're creating. And you obviously found ways to communicate with this child, and that's absolutely critical, because one of the things that my brother would tell people was, when you teach something to someone with autism or establish a relationship as you were doing, make sure you do it right, because it will be a lot harder to change it or erase it than with somebody who doesn't have autism. And one somewhat humorous story that I was told is, a parent told me this. David was a 4-year-old son was diagnosed with autism, so she brought a tutor in, and the tutor was from Tennessee and had a deep Southern accent. And the first thing the tutor did was to say, David, I'm going to teach you colors. I'll hold up a color, I'll pronounce it, and then you repeat the color to me. So she held up the color red, and with her accent, she said, David, this is red. And David said, this is red. And Alice, who told me this story, says David is now 40 years old, but to this day, the color is red.
That's
And
so funny.
and one of the things I looked for when I was doing interviews was uh, I wanted to find out how people thought about my brother's sense of humor. And I'd heard a lot of stories, but I was wondering how you would tell these stories without mocking the person. I knew my brother would never mock someone with autism, and some of the best stories I got were from parents. Like I got that one from Alice. So I would ask people about that, uh, and somebody in Japan who knew Gary well uh, started me on the right track. She said, "Don, uh, when Gary tells a story, he's tell about one of these people with autism. He tells it the way you or I would talk about our children." And as soon as he said that, it resonated with me. Of course, we tell our stories about things that our 2 year old did. We tell them lovingly. We don't feel that we're mocking them. And then somebody else that I interviewed after that gave me the icing on the cake. They said, when Gary tells a story, there's always something it illustrates about autism. And that's when I realized how parents, how my brother, how others can tell stories that are like that last story, humorous, but they're not in any way mockingly, and they have a purpose. One of the stories my brother told that someone relayed to me was of a teenager with autism who would go around to local delicatessens and ask if they had any leftovers he could have. And on one 90-degree day in Raleigh, North Carolina, he was given about 20 sandwiches from the delicatessen. He put them in the trunk of his car and forgot about them. They were made with mayonnaise. About 4 hours later, he showed up at the picnic and he put the sandwiches out on the picnic table, and a dozen people got food poisoning. So
No.
my brother's reaction, because one of the things he brought to his training was at that time, and I want to emphasize at that time, ABA at that time was focused on taking a child with autism and fitting him into the mold of what they considered to be the normal child. What my brother brought to the program was to teach was he said, no. First, you learn what's going on in the mind of the child. Then you design strategies to address whatever needs to be addressed. And one of the things Gary would tell people is build on their strengths, build on their interests. He had a parent who said to him, my 10-year-old comes home from school at 3 o'clock and just raises hell until dinner time. What can I do? And Gary said, you must know his interests and his strengths, build on them, have him doing things that he likes to do during those 3 hours. Well, when Gary heard about the food poisoning, his reaction, again, keeping in mind that he wants to build on someone's strengths and interests, he said, well, maybe for next year's picnic, we can have him get the paper plates and napkins. But,
Exactly.
but that was something that he was always looking for was what are your strengths and interests? How can I build on that? How can I motivate you? And obviously the first thing is game. So to tie all of this together, the first thing you did that was right was just to demonstrate through the way you dealt with it to the patients that would have shown through your voice, through your actions, that you cared. You obviously established a trust relationship with her. And one of the other things that you did that I've learned, because sometimes I have a presenter with me who knows a lot about the brain and brain science, and then we'll talk about the connection between the brain and autism. So, and I don't pretend to know anything about left brain, right brain, whatever, but I've learned a few things. And one thing that I've heard some of them say, showing a diagram of the brain, is that when somebody is throwing a tantrum, having a meltdown, overly excited, you are not going to be able to communicate rationally with them. There has to be a separation between just getting them to calm down and then trying to deal rationally with the situation. And again, looking at a diagram of the brain, I've heard them say There's no magical number. That, in other words, you can't say, well, it's 10 minutes or 2 hours or 3 days. It depends on the person. So you just have to be patient until they're calm, until they're ready to deal with. And when you can actually say to them, well, if this were to happen again, how do you think I should have reacted? How do you think I reacted this time? But what's sticks in my mind is that separation. First, calm them down. And another thing that sticks in my mind is uh, think of yourself as a mirror. When this person is getting out of control, and I suspect you did this just because of the person you are and probably came natural to you. But if you had escalated with your voice by threatening, by in any way, then that would escalate the situation. And it's easy to say, but there's a term for it I learned recently, so I like to use the term rational detachment. It's reminding yourself that you're the professional, or you're the parent, you're the expert, and that can be damn hard because
It
you've
can
got this
be.
child that you've given your life to. You've thought you were connecting with them, and all of a sudden they're screaming curse words at you. They're kicking you in the knee. They're trying to throw a punch at you, and it's very easy to say, keep your calm and remind yourself that you're the expert. But you've got to remind yourself, I'm going to be a mirror. If I, even though I have a right to, if my voice starts to get louder, and I start to show my exasperation, then the person I'm dealing with is going to get louder and more out of control. And one of the things I picked up just recently from that one of the professionals again that zoomed in on our session said two things that really stuck with me. He said, number one, he said, keep your sentences brief. He said, so for example, and this is not inconsistent with the way my wife, who taught special education for years, would say, don't give them two commands in a row. By the time they get to the starting on the first, they will have forgotten the second. And just as a side note, I use college students to help me on my gardens. That's the other thing I do. I've got 175 flower gardens that I handle. That's what keeps me in exercise. My wife handles our 10 raised beds of vegetables. But one of the things I found with college students is I would say to them, something to me was simple, like, when you finish weeding that garden, would you take that wheelbarrow over and dump the mulch in that pile? Invariably, college students, A students would come to me and say, I finished the weeding. What was it you wanted me to do after that? But with people with autism, it's even more so. So what I heard this professional say was, limit your words. So instead of saying, remember, in 10 minutes, we're going to the library, you'll have to collect your books. And when we get to the library, we have to be very quiet. Just say 10 minutes to the library. Leave out your adjectives, leave out your excessive words, and talk in incomplete sentences. The other thing he said that never would have occurred to me is watch your shoulders when a situation is escalating. It said, if you're escalating with it, your shoulders will be moving upward. So you remind yourself, keep my shoulders down, because that will also help you relax and will give off a body language cue to the person you're working with. So what's been fascinating to me is just all that I'm learning about this. It's common to say you're never too old to learn, but every time I do one of these sessions, I learn. And the other thing is, when we do our sessions, people work in groups of 4, 5, or 6, depending on the size of the crowd, at a table. And throughout the session, whether it's 2 hours or an entire day, we'll challenge them with questions to discuss. Because, again, another popular saying is, none of us is as smart as all of us. And that's true. And I don't pretend that when somebody comes to one of our sessions, all the valuable information they're going to get is going to be from me or the presenters. There may be the person in their group who knows the least about autism, but has something they're going to contribute to that group during the group discussions if we allow the time for group discussions. So
You talked about it a little bit when you mentioned ABA versus Teach, but can you, if you can, because I know your brother Gary is the one that was the director of Teach, but if you know and you can share just a little bit of information about how Teach is different from ABA or what Teach is, that would be great.
Uh, Today, they're very similar. And the director of Teach said to me a few months ago, if you find that one of the programs is not working somewhere, it's probably not because it's Teach or ABA. It's probably because of the way people are implementing it, which may not be correctly. Now, and I do hear still some stories about ABA where they're still stuck on uh, too much manipulating the child to the idea of normal that they have rather than letting the training strategies follow what the child needs. Uh, but like I say, for the most part, they're very similar today. But that was one of the major changes. And I heard some horror stories from people back in the 1970s and 80s who would tell me about how certain ABA groups would use punishment as the major way of trying to reach a child, deprivation, punishment. Uh, but again, most of the people implementing ABA programs now have moved away from that, and you would expect this after 70 years of coexistence. You would expect each would pick up on the best of the other, and I think a lot of that has happened. Um, and I've had to become familiar with ABA because most of the groups that I need to collaborate with here in Northern New York and throughout the United States, more of them are ABA than Teach. So I've had to get to know them, and there are some wonderful people working on ABA just as there are on Teach. Actually, Gary got into this accidentally, and he a gentleman named Theo Peters from Belgium came in 1982 to North Carolina and spent a week with Gary in the Teach program. And then he said, "Would you come to Belgium next year and bring and train 40 people?" So Gary had never trained that many people at once, but he put together a team. Some of whom are still working for Teach, and I spoke with them, and they went over to Belgium, and they put together a 1 week training program, which has become the model for what they do. But as someone explained to me, in Europe, they're a lot more centralized, most countries are, than here in the United States, which is why something can take a long, long time to spread, even if it's validated here in the United States. But he said in Europe, uh, they did the session in 1983 in Belgium, and a few people from Denmark and England and Norway, other European countries came. And they liked what they saw, so they invited Gary to bring a team to their country the following year. And again, because they're so much more centralized in Europe, it spread much more quickly. And that accounts for how he became literally known as a worldwide expert. Uh, one of the he ended up advising the. I had heard from his son that he thought that Gary had been influential in guiding the king of Saudi Arabia with his grandchild, and he had heard that a high Russian official had brought his daughter to North Carolina to work with Gary. But I was able to find people who could give me firsthand documentation of each of these stories, so I included those in the book. One of the things that really made an impression on me was this high-ranking official, and I think I know his name. I think it was an ambassador in the 1980s, but he sent a lower-level official to North Carolina with his daughter, and the lower-level official said to Gary, "Keep her as long as you need to, but let us know what we can do." 6 months later, the lower-level official returned to North Carolina, and Gary handed him a report, and he said, "I wish we could have seen her sooner because the potential now for helping her is a lot more limited." Uh, that really made an impression on me on how important it is to get an early diagnosis and then treatment. And these days, you have people who there are waiting lists of 18 months in some places for diagnosis, 18 months for treatment or work with a therapist after you have the diagnosis. The dean of education at a local college has to take his 19-year-old son 3 hours away to get treatment, to get the therapy that he needs. But as a sidebar to the story about Russia, uh, when my brother, after my brother had made that statement to the lower level official, the lower level official handed the report back to Gary, while the people there with him looked on in astonishment. And he said, "We don't take bad news back to Russia." And that really struck me when there were reports recently that that Putin doesn't understand the losses they're suffering in Ukraine, because some of his generals are reluctant to bring bad news back to him. So again, I picked up a lot of side stories and information, but the main thing that impressed upon me was how important it is to reach people at an early age. And we have parents who won't get a diagnosis because they're afraid. They want to hide from it. We have parents who get the diagnosis and then don't want anyone else to know, so they won't get their child the professional support that they could get. And again, my wife is a special ed teacher. You probably know this. Many special ed teachers know this, that there's a problem with parents of many children with any kind of a disability, because people are afraid of the stigma, which is another reason it's so important to educate the public. Uh, there's just so much to this, but it's so easy to convey and communicate once we can just get people in a room together and have the opportunity to communicate with them. A somewhat humorous story. Another thing that people with autism often have, and I keep saying often have, or many, because there is no characteristic that you can say is characteristic of all people with autism. And a professional in the field told me a story about a colleague he disrespects, who told a parent, "Your child can't possibly have autism because he can make eye contact." Now, yes, many people with autism have difficulty making eye contact, but to use that as a basis of diagnosis and suggest that therefore everyone with autism has difficulty with eye contact is ridiculous. But this is a story where Gary should have known better. I like to tell stories, obviously, where he's the hero, but this one, he should have known better. He was talking with a teenager who said, "I have a girlfriend." And I should say the challenge many people with autism have is they don't know when a task is over. They don't know when it's completed. So some teachers have what they call a left to right strategy. You put the work that's got to be done on the left, you move it to the center on your desk when you're ready to tackle it independently, and then you put it in a receptacle or a bag or something if it's a product, when the product is completed. So that's how the child with autism knows, I'm done when everything is in that receptacle, or I'm done when this checklist is checked off, whatever. Well, the teenager said to Gary, "I have a girlfriend, but I don't know what to do with her." So Gary said, "Well, you could take her to a movie, you could take her to a restaurant, you could go to the beach." About a month later, he ran into the teenager in town, and he said, "How are you doing?" The teenager said, "Well, I'm doing fine, but we're no longer going out together." "Why not?" "Well, I took her to a movie, I took her to the restaurant, and I took her to the beach." Gary forgot to tell him that that's not the end of the dating process. That can be the start of it. And he thought that he did the three things that Gary suggested, and
it's over.
That's it.
Right.
So,
wow.
And again, there are humorous stories for a lot of these, but people pay attention because they have a theme. They have something they illustrate about people with autism. The one thing that more people told me made an impression on them than anything else was Gary's writings and speaking about what he called the culture of autism. And he has a chapter in a book that he co-wrote about this. Gary wants people to think about autism as you would think about a different culture, different traditions, different habits, different ways of thinking. And an analogy he would use is, if you had people from another country come here and you didn't speak their language and they didn't speak yours, we wouldn't think of them as having a disability. We would say, hey, this is interesting. I want to learn more about them. And that's the way he wants people to think about autism. Autism is a disability only because of the way society thinks about it, which puts people with autism at a disadvantage in society. But it's not a disability in the sense that they have intellectual uh, that they're intellectually different, any more different than you and I are. In fact, we have a mug that we put the saying on: uh, "People with autism think differently than you and I, but so do you and I."
Right.
And I try and make that point to people. You and I think, with the limited time we've known each other, have developed a mutual respect, but we certainly don't think the same way. I mean, my
Right.
God, anybody who's got a successful marriage is lying if they claim that it's because they and their spouse think the same.
Right.
Uh, I, I mean, my wife and I, we've been married 41 years and happily, but we go at it in certain things, and we continue to have to learn how we each think. And that's really all it is with someone with autism. We just have to learn how they think and help them understand how we think.
That's so real. I'm so glad you even brought that up because that's really real, and we don't even think about it like that sometimes. Like we all think differently, so we shouldn't think of it like you said as a disability. And so with that being said, I would love for you, because you talked about like how it is harder for parents who has a child with a disability or who's on the spectrum. It's harder for them because they have to do so much, so many other things. And I would love for you to give advice to parents, especially since I have a group of homeschooling parents. Many of those children, some of those children are on the spectrum. What advice would you give to parents with children on the spectrum who are also homeschooling, but in general as well?
Number one, get an early diagnosis as early as possible. Number two, uh, work with a professional at the earliest age possible. Number three, uh, most importantly, have patience. Uh, Look for the strengths and the interests of your child and work with them. One parent told me I use the if then strategy. That's the most important thing someone ever told me. If you do this, then you can do that. And again, it's something we do naturally with our children, whether they have autism or not. Yeah, if you want to be able to play on your video machine for half an hour, you can do it if you just help me dry the dishes.
You need to clean
Uh,
up. Exactly.
uh, and maybe most importantly is what we were just discussing. Recognize that uh, your child is going to think differently than a little bit beyond the realm of what you would expect from the average child. So don't just treat your child with expectations that you would have from anyone. But that's good advice really for anyone with their child, even if their child fits the mold of being what society would consider perfectly normal. It's just that you need to be ready to deal with more extreme situations. Your child is going to obsess over certain things. Uh, be prepared to deal with that. And again, patience is a key word, understanding. And the parents that I've spoken with, and I've spoken with many who uh, have stuck with it, have developed as much of a loving relationship with their child uh, as anyone else. Now, some people with autism are huggers. Many of them fear physical contact. Don't look for your reinforcement in any one particular way. Your child may be one who fears physical contact. Gradually, maybe you'll be able to get him or her to a certain point, but don't expect to necessarily be able to get them to show their love for you with the kind of external uh, uh, responses that you might expect from someone else. But there'll be cues. There'll be things that will tell you. I spoke with the parent just yesterday. Her young son, well, he's 13 now, is going to be presenting at our full day forum tomorrow. His superpower, as some of them like to call it, is music. and he actually has had a local orchestra perform a piece that he's written at 13 years old. I can't carry a tune for 2 minutes, and this kid is also writing music that's being used by an orchestra. But look for their superpower and reinforce them in that, and be patient because they are going to obsess over things. Probably the most difficult thing to deal with is that they will do things to extreme. So I was talking with a middle aged man now who has autism. I said, "What's it like having autism?" And he said, "Well, he said I can focus on something to a point that's good for accomplishing what I'm working on, but to the point where I miss appointments, I let people down, I disappoint people." And as he's talking, I'm saying to myself, "That's me. I it's an ability I have that I go look to the local coffee house and I can work for 3 hours and not hear a sound." Uh, but I worked for a newspaper once. The secretary was across the aisle from me. My boss, the editor, was 2 steps up behind me, and the secretary comes over to me. I'm focused on an article I'm writing, and she shakes my arm. She says, "Don, do you like your job?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, then you better answer Ernie because he's been calling your name for 5 minutes." But the difference between me and the child or the person who was telling me about his situation is I have the executive functions that I can figure out that this can be a problem for me, and I can develop strategies so that I don't get so focused on something that uh, I'm ignoring everything else.
Right.
Person I was talking with can learn that. And that's what a special ed teacher or a parent or someone does for him. They work with him to help him understand that it can be a disadvantage to focus so much that you forget about the world around you. And they can give him the strategies to deal with that. And once he has those strategies, he's as well fortified, you might say, as I am in terms of executive functions to deal with that situation. So probably the major advice to parents, you every again, to know one person with autism is to know one person with autism. But that's also true with all people. To know one person is to know one person. It's just more important with someone with autism because the characteristics that are going to be different from the average child may be more extreme. And you just have to get to know that. Some of these things can be charming. Uh, Now, the parent I was talking about that whose son is going to present for us tomorrow, she was saying that in terms of physical contact, he's just the opposite. She said he hugs to an extreme. And one of the problems I had when he was 2 and 3, that was very cute. And people would love it when 2 or 3 year old would come up to them and hug them. But when he got to be 8 and 10 and 12, it's inappropriate. And so I've had to work with him to say, you don't just go over to someone and throw your arms around them with a strong hug. Uh, and so again, that's the major thing is that just if there's a word of encouragement is if you stay with it as a parent, I have a lot more success stories than not. People have gone on to create resumes that I admire, that any of us would aspire to have. People who have gone on to write books. Now, one other interesting aspect that most people don't know about, I mentioned that it was near the end of my writing process that someone suggested I interview people who had worked with my brother on the criminal justice system. And I did interview 5 people who worked on different aspects of it. And one of the things I found out is why people on the spectrum are more susceptible to charges of pornography than the average person. A trainer in Florida said to me, when I conduct a workshop, I will ask the men in the audience, how many of you learned about sex from your fathers? He said, maybe 1 in 100 will raise their hand. He said, because most of us learn about sex from our siblings or our peers. Well, people with autism very often don't have a peer group. And one of the things that's characteristic of many of them is loneliness. They have difficulty making friends. They have difficulty getting people to accept them. So they don't get their learn. They don't learn about sex education through uh, their peer group. And because they don't have a peer group, they spend more time on the computer than most people do.
Mm.
So when they go to a porn site, it's not for the reason that many people would go to a porn site. They go to a porn site because that's how they get their sex education, not because they have any ulterior motives, not to titillate themselves. Uh, and also, people with autism often don't realize that the police can track porn sites. So
Mm.
you put all those things together, no peer group, extra time on the computer, and police who can track porn sites. And that's why people with autism are more susceptible to charges of pornography than others. And I talked with a professor in Michigan whose son spent 10 years on the sex offenders list uh, only because of misunderstandings like this. And in fact, at his trial, uh, 5 experts, 3 of them from the prosecution, all testified that there was no intent when he went to a porn site and that he should be given an 18-month, I forget what they call it, a diversionary, I think, sentence, uh, where he would be on probation. But even with all that, the judge wouldn't accept that recommendation, and the only way he would allow this person to avoid uh, uh, jail time was if he agreed to go on the sex offender list, which he stayed on for 10 years. And I think he got off it last year. I know he was supposed to get off it last year. Now, this is a man who's brilliant. He's written 6 books, some of them about that experience with the criminal justice system that I just told you about, uh, others uh, about different aspects of autism. And again, not all, but so many people with autism have what Connor, my 24-year-old friend with autism, says it's a superpower. Uh, so just a question of patience, getting to know them, and having faith. But one of the other reasons I mentioned that Gary would say to people, if you teach them, teach it right, is because what that says to me is the first encounter you or I have with someone with autism is will be a lot more significant than with someone else. So, as a teacher, for example, I can get off on the wrong foot with a child, and whether it's their fault or my fault doesn't matter. But if I recognize it, I'm skilled enough. You're skilled enough in special education. We can find ways of remedying it and getting on their good side. If we, but when we have our first meeting or interaction with someone with autism, we are going to establish a trust or distrust relationship that may be very, very difficult to change. And that's why it's so critical that we understand autism and that we try and be patient as we try and learn more about somebody with autism.
Wow. Thank you so much, Don. You all, this was a conversation with Don talking about autism, talking about his life, his work. I really do appreciate you stopping by to have this conversation with me. Thank you. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, and I will see you on the next one. Peace.